The alley reeked of copper and rain, a nauseating combination that made Hannah's three-chambered heart pound against her ribs like a war drum. She pressed her back against the cold brick wall, feeling the rough texture through her stolen jacket, a garment far too thin for this planet's unpredictable climate. Above her, the sodium streetlights flickered with that particular orange glow that Earth seemed so fond of, casting dancing shadows that made every movement seem threatening. Her pursuers were close. She could hear their boots splashing through puddles, their voices crackling over communication devices that were primitive by her standards but effective enough to coordinate a hunt through the maze of Manhattan's Lower East Side. Blood, human blood, she noted, with clinical detachment, dripped from a gash on her forearm where one of them had gotten close, too close, with a blade. The wound wasn't deep, but it burned with an intensity that reminded her just how different her physiology was from the species surrounding her. On her home world of Aetheria, such an injury would have sealed itself within minutes, bioluminescent cells rushing to knit torn flesh back together. Here, disguised as one of them, she'd suppressed her natural healing abilities along with every other telltale sign of her origins. The camouflage was necessary. It was also slowly killing her. 3 months. That's how long she'd been trapped on this backwater planet, ever since her reconnaissance vessel had been struck by what the humans would have called a meteor, but what she knew was deliberate sabotage. Someone had wanted her here, stranded and vulnerable, cut off from her people and any hope of extraction. The question that haunted her every waking moment was simple and terrifying: who and why? Her mission had been straightforward: observe, catalog, report. Earth was on the Galactic Council's watch list as a developing world, one that showed promise but also concerning tendencies toward self-destruction. She was supposed to be invisible, a ghost gathering data. Instead, she'd become the hunted. The footsteps grew louder. Hannah's enhanced hearing picked up their individual heartbeats now, 4 distinct rhythms approaching from 2 directions. They were coordinating, boxing her in with the efficiency of trained professionals. Not police, their equipment was too sophisticated, their movements too precise. Private contractors maybe, or government operatives from one of the clandestine organizations that officially didn't exist. She'd stumbled into their operation 2 weeks ago purely by accident while trying to scavenge parts for a transmitter. They'd been moving something in a warehouse on the docks, something that hummed with a frequency that hurt her teeth and made her vision blur. Something not of this world. That's when everything had gone to hell. They'd spotted her, chased her, and somehow tagged her with a tracking beacon she still hadn't managed to fully disable. Ever since, she'd been running, staying one step ahead through a combination of superior technology and sheer desperation. But she was tired now, so tired, and the suppressants she'd been using to mask her alien biology were running low. Without them, she'd start glowing like a festival beacon, her skin taking on the characteristic violet shimmer of her people. Subtle, real subtle, in a species that came exclusively in shades of brown, beige, and pink. A garbage truck rumbled past the alley's entrance, momentarily blocking the view from the street. Hannah seized the moment, pushing off from the wall and sprinting deeper into the darkness, her footfalls barely audible despite her speed. She'd always been fast. Aetherians evolved on a high-gravity world where being quick meant survival, but here on Earth, with its lighter pull, she could move like wind when necessary. The problem was that such movement drew attention, and attention was the last thing she needed. She vaulted over a chain-link fence with easy grace, landing in what appeared to be a small courtyard behind a restaurant. The smell of cooking oil and something spicy hit her like a physical force, making her stomach clench. When had she last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Food was complicated when your digestive system was designed for an entirely different biochemistry. Rice seemed safe. Bread, sometimes. She'd gotten violently ill from coffee, a lesson learned the hard way in a diner in Queens during her first week of freedom. The back door of the restaurant burst open, yellow light spilling out along with a cook carrying a bag of trash. He was young, maybe 20, with dark hair and tired eyes that suggested a long shift. He froze when he saw her, his gaze taking in her disheveled appearance, the blood on her arm, the wild look in her eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then his expression shifted from surprise to concern, and he asked something in Mandarin she'd picked up enough languages in 3 months to recognize the tones, even if she didn't understand every word. Before she could respond, before she could manufacture some explanation that wouldn't raise more questions, the sound of voices and footsteps exploded from the alley she'd just left. Her pursuers had reached the fence. They'd be over it in seconds. The young cook's eyes widened as he took in the situation with quick intelligence. Then he did something Hannah didn't expect, something that would change everything. He gestured urgently toward the open door behind him, his meaning clear even without shared language. "Hide, quickly, come inside." It was an offer of sanctuary from a complete stranger, motivated by nothing more than basic human decency. On Aetheria, such a gesture would carry ritual significance, creating bonds of obligation and protection. Here, she suspected, it was simply who this person was, someone who saw another being in trouble and chose to help. The kitchen was chaos, incarnated a symphony of sizzling woks, shouting voices, and steam rising in clouds that obscured the fluorescent lights overhead. Hannah stumbled through the doorway as the young cook pulled her inside, his grip surprisingly strong on her uninjured arm. He kicked the door shut behind them and immediately began speaking rapidly in Mandarin to an older woman who stood at the main cooking station, her hands never pausing in their rhythmic chopping of vegetables. The woman's eyes flicked to Hannah, taking in every detail with a calculating assessment that spoke of hard-won survival instincts. Then she barked something that made 2 other kitchen workers immediately move to block the view from the dining area. Hannah's translator implant, one of the few pieces of technology she'd managed to salvage from her crashed ship, struggled to keep up with the rapid-fire dialect, catching only fragments. Danger, police, hide, girl in trouble. The older woman, who carried herself with the her wool, unmistakable authority of an owner, made a decision with the speed of someone who'd faced difficult choices before. She pointed toward a narrow door beside the walk-in freezer, then rattled off what sounded like instructions to her staff. Within seconds, Hannah found herself being ushered down a steep staircase into a basement that smelled of stored vegetables and old concrete. The young cook, his name tag read David in English letters, guided her to a corner, where plastic crates of bok choy created a makeshift barrier. He gestured for her to sit, then disappeared back up the stairs, leaving her in the dim space with only a single bulb for illumination. Hannah's hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with her as the immediate danger passed. She pressed her palm against the wound on her arm, feeling the sluggish pulse of blood darker than human blood, more purple than red, though in this light it might pass. The injury throbbed in time with her racing hearts, plural, a reminder that she was fundamentally different from the people trying to help her. Above, she could hear muffled voices, heavy footsteps. Her pursuers had entered the restaurant. She caught fragments of conversation, American accents, official-sounding demands to search the premises, the older woman's strident protests about health codes and proper warrants. The woman was buying time, refusing to be intimidated by men with badges that might or might not be genuine. Hannah felt a strange warmth in her chest, an emotion her people called catharsis, the gratitude owed to strangers who show unexpected courage. On Earth, she thought they might simply call it humanity, though the irony of that term wasn't lost on her. David returned carrying a first aid kit and a bottle of water. He knelt beside her in the cramped space, close enough that she could see the concern etched into his features, the way his eyes kept darting to the wound on her arm. He opened the kit and pulled out antiseptic wipes, but hesitated, looking at her face with a question in his eyes. Permission, she realized. He was asking permission to help. She nodded, peeling back the torn sleeve of her jacket to expose the gash. David's expression didn't change as he began cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency, though she saw his pupils dilate slightly, a human stress response. The cut looked worse than she'd thought, ragged and deep, and the blood that continued to seep from it definitely carried that wrong purple tint. If David noticed the color, he said nothing. Instead, he worked in silence, applying butterfly bandages to pull the edges of the wound together, then wrapping it in clean gauze. His hands were steady despite the shaking that had begun in his shoulders, the delayed reaction to harboring a fugitive in his family's restaurant. When he finished, he sat back and looked at her directly, really looked at her, and Hannah had the uncomfortable sensation that he was seeing more than she wanted him to. His next words, spoken in careful, accented English, confirmed her suspicion. "You're not from around here." It wasn't a question. Not just. "Not from New York. Not from anywhere I know." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Those men, they're not regular police. And you're not a regular person in trouble." His eyes dropped to the bandage, where a faint purple stain was already seeping through the white gauze. "That's not normal blood. Still not a question. Just observations, delivered in a tone that suggested he'd already accepted the impossible and was simply waiting for confirmation. Hannah's mind raced through possible responses, calculating risks and benefits with the speed her enhanced neural pathways allowed. Denial seemed pointless. This human had already connected enough dots to form a dangerous picture. Confirmation might endanger him further, but it might also be her only option if she wanted to maintain this unexpected sanctuary. The voices upstairs had grown louder, more aggressive. Someone was threatening to call real police, and the older woman was responding with the kind of creative profanity that apparently transcended language barriers because it made one of the searchers actually apologize. "No," Hannah finally said, her own English colored by the accent she'd carefully cultivated to sound vaguely Eastern European useful because it excused any oddities in her speech patterns. "Not from around here at all. And those men." She hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. "They work for people who want to study me. Dissect me, maybe. I'd really prefer they didn't." The attempt at humor fell flat, her tone too hollow to sell it properly. David didn't laugh. Instead, his expression settled into something that looked like resolve, a decision being made in real time. "My grandmother," he said, gesturing upward toward where the older woman's voice could still be heard berating the intruders. "She came here, and from Fujian with nothing. People helped her, strangers helped her, even when it was dangerous." He met Hannah's eyes again, and she saw in them something she'd observed repeatedly during her time on Earth but still didn't fully understand: the human capacity for compassion toward the utterly alien. "She taught us that we help people who need help. That's all I need to know." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "You stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we figure out what to do next. But tonight, you're safe." The footsteps upstairs were retreating now, the searchers apparently satisfied or at least deterred by the older woman's forceful resistance. Hannah listened to them go, her enhanced hearing tracking their movement out through the front of the restaurant and back into the street. They'd be watching the building now, waiting for her to emerge. But they'd lost her trail, at least temporarily, and that gave her something she'd been desperately short on: time. Time to think, to plan, to maybe fix the transmitter components hidden in her backpack. Time to figure out who had sabotaged her ship and why someone on Earth had technology that felt wrong in all the ways that made her skin crawl. David had started back up the stairs when Hannah spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate in any language, human or Aetherian, but they were all she had. He paused, looking back over his shoulder with a slight smile that transformed his tired features into something younger, more hopeful. "Thank you for not asking more questions," she added. His smile widened just a fraction. "Oh, I have about 1,000 questions," he said, "but they can wait. Rest now. You look like you haven't slept in days." He wasn't wrong. Sleep had been a luxury she couldn't afford, not when every moment of unconsciousness might be the one where they finally caught her. Hannah didn't sleep, despite David's suggestion. Sleep required trust, and trust was a currency she'd depleted weeks ago when her ship had spiraled through Earth's atmosphere in a ball of flame and desperation. Instead, she sat in the basement's corner, her back pressed against the cool concrete wall, and took inventory of her situation with the methodical precision her training demanded. The backpack beside her contained everything she'd managed to salvage: a partially functional quantum communicator that lacked the power source to actually transmit beyond Earth's orbit, 3 universal suppressant injectors that would keep her alien physiology hidden for maybe another week if she rationed them carefully, a datapad with corrupted files that might contain the answer to who had sabotaged her mission, and a photograph she'd taken with an ancient Polaroid camera she'd found in a thrift store, a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset. Because even stranded aliens apparently needed to document their trauma with tourist snapshots. The absurdity of that last item almost made her laugh. Almost. Laughter felt like a luxury from another lifetime, back when she'd been Lieutenant Hannah Velthos of the Aetherian Survey Corps, a promising young officer on a routine observation mission. Now she was just Hannah, no last name, no rank, no identity beyond the fake papers she'd purchased from a forger in Chinatown, who'd asked no questions and accepted the gold from her broken communicator's casing as payment. The forger had done good work. Her ID claimed she was Elena Volkov, immigrant from Moldova, legal resident with a work permit and everything. She wondered if the real Elena Volkov existed somewhere, if she'd mind having an alien borrowing her identity while running from shadow organizations and trying not to glow in the dark. Above, the restaurant had finally gone quiet. Hannah's internal chronometer, a biological feature, her people evolved to track their home world's 30-hour day cycle, told her it was approaching 3 in the morning Earth time. The kitchen staff would have finished cleaning, the last customers long gone. She should try to rest, or at least enter the meditative state. Her people used to process trauma and conserve energy. Instead, she found herself pulling out the data pad, its screen flickering to life with that particular violet glow that marked all Aetherian technology. The corrupted files mocked her with fragments of information, coordinates that led nowhere, partial communiques that cut off mid-sentence, sensor logs showing the moment something had struck her ship, something that had appeared on her instruments only microseconds before impact, as if it had materialized from nothing. That impossibility haunted her. Aetherian sensors could detect objects moving at relativistic speeds, could spot a pebble in orbit around Jupiter from Mars' orbit. For something to appear without warning meant technology more advanced than anything in the Galactic Council's databases, or it meant someone had found a way to fool sensors that had been refined over millennia. Either option was terrifying. Either option suggested her presence on Earth wasn't the accident she'd initially believed, but something deliberate, orchestrated, part of a plan she couldn't yet see. The basement door creaked open, and Hannah's hand instinctively moved to the small plasma cutter she kept hidden in her boot, a weapon disguised as a flashlight, because humans still relied on simple photons for illumination and would never suspect the innocent-looking cylinder could slice through steel. But it was only David, carrying a steaming bowl and a blanket that looked hand-knitted. He descended the stairs carefully, balancing his offerings with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years navigating the restaurant's cramped spaces. The smell hit her first: ginger, garlic, something with star anise, and despite her alien biochemistry's frequent protests about Earth food, her stomach growled audibly. David smiled at the sound, setting the bowl down beside her. "Kanji," he said. "Rice porridge. It's plain, just ginger and a little salt. My grandmother makes it when people are sick or upset. It's—" He searched for the word, gentle, easy to digest. He'd remembered her reaction to coffee, she realized, remembered and extrapolated that her system might be sensitive to Earth food in general. The observation showed an intelligence she'd underestimated, a capacity for deduction that made him either an excellent ally or a significant risk. She wasn't sure which yet. She accepted the bowl, and the first spoonful was indeed gentle, warm, and soothing, with just enough flavor to be interesting without overwhelming her altered taste receptors. David settled on a crate across from her, maintaining a respectful distance while still being close enough for conversation. For several minutes they sat in comfortable silence, the only sound the occasional scrape of spoon against bowl. Hannah found herself relaxing incrementally, the warmth of the food spreading through her system, easing tensions she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten they existed. When she finally spoke, the words came easier than expected. "On my world," she began, then paused, reconsidering the wisdom of this confession. But David simply waited, his expression open and patient, so she continued. "On my world, sharing food creates a bond, a responsibility. The giver and receiver are connected, obligated to each other's welfare." She met his eyes. "By your customs, this might mean nothing. But by mine, you've done something significant." David considered this, his head tilting slightly in a gesture she'd learned indicated contemplation in humans. "My grandmother would say something similar," he finally replied. "Not exactly the same, but close. She believes feeding someone is sacred. That you don't let people go hungry if you can help it, because hunger is—" He struggled with translation. "It's a wound that doesn't heal right. It changes you." The simple profundity of his words struck something deep in Hannah's chest. Hunger as a wound. Yes. She'd been hungry in more ways than one since arriving on Earth, hungry for home, for understanding, for the simple comfort of being among her own kind. The physical hunger she'd learned to manage with rice and bread and whatever else her system would tolerate, but the other hungers gnawed at her constantly, eroding her sense of self with each passing day of isolation. She'd tried so hard to remain clinical, to treat her predicament as just another mission parameter to solve. But sitting here in this basement with a human who'd risked his family's safety for a stranger, she felt something crack in her carefully maintained emotional defenses. "I can't go home," she said, and was horrified to hear her voice waver. "My ship is destroyed. My communicator can't reach my people. And even if it could, even if I could signal for extraction, whoever sabotaged my mission, they're still out there. They'd know. They'd be waiting." The words poured out now, months of isolation finding release. "I'm trapped here, and I don't know why. And those men who are hunting me, they have something. Technology that shouldn't exist here, not for decades at least. Something that feels wrong in a way I can't explain. Like it's—" She gestured helplessly, "like it's from somewhere else too. Not Aetherian, but not human either." David's expression had grown serious as she spoke, his earlier ease replaced by focused attention. "The thing in the warehouse," he said slowly. "When they caught you, what was it? What did it look like?" Hannah shook her head. "I only saw it for a moment before they spotted me. Some kind of device, maybe 3 meters tall crystalline structure, emitting radiation across spectrums that shouldn't be possible with Earth technology. It was." She paused, searching for accurate description. "Singing. Not sound, exactly, but vibrations that resonated with frequencies my people use for quantum entanglement communication, like it was calling to something or someone. The implications hung heavy in the air between them." If there was non-human technology already on Earth, technology sophisticated enough to interfere with Galactic Council sensors, then Hannah's presence might be no accident at all. She might have been lured here deliberately, shot down and stranded as part of some larger plan. But whose plan? And for what purpose? The Galactic Council had strict protocols about contact with developing worlds. Earth wasn't supposed to have access to interstellar technology for at least another century, not until humanity had resolved their internal conflicts, enough to present a united front to the broader galactic community. Someone was breaking those protocols, and breaking them in ways that suggested resources and knowledge beyond what any single civilization should possess. David stood abruptly, pacing the small basement floor with agitated energy. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to her. "Okay, so, aliens are real. You're one of them. Other aliens might also be here. Secret organizations are hunting you. There's some kind of dangerous alien technology in a warehouse somewhere in the city." He stopped, looking at her with an expression caught between terror and excitement. "This is insane. This is absolutely insane, and I should probably be freaking out more than I am." He paused. "Why am I not freaking out more?" "Shock." Hannah supplied helpfully. "Humans process existential threats through a predictable psychological cascade. You're currently in the acceptance without processing phase. The actual emotional reaction will hit later, probably when you're trying to sleep." David barked a short laugh. "Great. Something to look forward to." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she'd learned indicated stress. "What do you need?" "To fix your communicator. To get home. To not get caught. What do you actually need?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline thrown into drowning waters, and Hannah found herself calculating possibilities with renewed focus. What did she need? The list was extensive, probably impossible, but David's earnest expression suggested he genuinely wanted to help, and she'd learned during her months of observation that humans, despite their limitations, possessed a remarkable capacity for achieving the improbable when properly motivated. She set down the empty kanji bowl and pulled her backpack closer, extracting the damaged communicator with careful reverence. The device was smaller than a human smartphone, its surface covered in bioluminescent circuits that pulsed weakly in the basement's dim light, a dying heartbeat counting down to complete system failure. "This," she said, holding it up for David to see, "is a quantum entanglement communicator. It can transmit messages instantaneously across light years by exploiting paired particles in superposition states. The theory is complicated, but the practical application is simple. I speak into this end, and someone hears me on the other end, no matter how far away they are." She turned the device over, revealing a cracked housing where the power core should have been. "The problem is that it requires an exotic matter power source specifically, a containment field maintaining antimatter in stable suspension. That core was destroyed when my ship crashed. Without it, this is just an expensive paperweight." David leaned closer, his eyes tracking the flowing patterns of light across the communicator's surface with undisguised fascination. "Antimatter," he repeated carefully. "Like actual antimatter? The stuff that annihilates regular matter on contact and releases tremendous energy?" Hannah nodded. "In controlled amounts, properly contained, it's the most efficient power source in the known galaxy. A gram of antimatter could power your entire city for weeks. The core in this device contained approximately 0.03 grams. She watched his eyes widen as he did the mental mathematics, understanding dawning. That's insane. That's technology that shouldn't exist. We can barely produce antimatter in particle accelerators, and we can only contain it for seconds." "Exactly," Hannah said. "Which brings us to the problem. I can't manufacture antimatter with Earth technology, and even if I could, I'd need specialized equipment to contain it safely. The alternative is finding a compatible power source that can generate equivalent energy output, We're talking sustained output of approximately 10 to the 15th joules per second. She saw his expression glaze slightly. At the numbers and translated, think of it like trying to power a laptop with a lightning bolt. The energy is there, but capturing it, regulating it, making it usable, that's the challenge. David sat back, processing this information with visible effort. Okay, so antimatter is out. What else could work? Nuclear? Some kind of advanced battery? Hannah appreciated his willingness to problem solve despite being completely out of his depth. There's theoretical precedent for using quantum vacuum energy fluctuations, but the extraction mechanism would require components I can't fabricate without a molecular assembler. Cold fusion might work if I could achieve the necessary confinement temperatures, but again, Earth doesn't have the material science yet. She paused, considering alternatives she'd been reluctant to pursue. There is one possibility. The device I saw in that warehouse, if it's what I think it is, if it's actually a quantum resonance amplifier, it might contain compatible power coupling systems. Even just components I could salvage might be enough to jury-rig something functional. The suggestion hung between them, and Hannah watched David's expression shift from thoughtful to incredulous. "You want to break into the warehouse," he said flatly. "The warehouse controlled by the people, actively hunting you. The place probably crawling with guards and security systems. That warehouse." When she didn't respond, he stood again, resuming his agitated pacing. "This is crazy. This is beyond crazy. This is suicide-level crazy." But even as he protested, Hannah could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, the problem solver in him already considering angles and possibilities despite the manifest danger. "I know," she admitted. "Under normal circumstances, I'd wait, plan, gather intelligence over weeks or months before attempting infiltration. But I don't have weeks or months. My suppressants will run out in 7 days, and when they do, my biology will reassert itself. I'll start glowing like a festival beacon visible from space if the conditions are right. Staying hidden will become impossible." She held up her bandaged arm. "Even now, with the suppressants active, injuries reveal me. Any medical examination would expose me, instantly. Any blood test, any scan, anything beyond superficial observation would show I'm not human." The reality of her timeline made the impossible necessary. "I break into that warehouse, or I get caught. Those are my options." David stopped pacing and leaned against a support beam, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive posture. "You said I," he pointed out. "I break in, not we. You're planning to do this alone." It wasn't a question. Hannah met his gaze steadily. "I won't ask you to risk more than you already have. You and your grandmother have given me shelter, food, kindness, things I had no right to expect. I won't compound that debt by dragging you into something that could get you killed." She meant it sincerely. Whatever obligation the food sharing had created, it didn't extend to active combat operations against armed adversaries. David deserved the chance to walk away, to return to his normal life of cooking shifts and family obligations, to forget the alien in his basement. But humans, she was learning, rarely acted according to logical risk assessment when emotional investment was involved. David pushed off from the beam and crouched down to her level, his expression set with determination that reminded her of young officers accepting their first combat assignments. "Here's the thing," he said quietly. "You're right that I'm scared. Terrified, actually. The rational part of my brain is screaming at me to walk away, to pretend this conversation never happened, to go back to my nice safe life of preparing dim sum and avoiding my grandmother's questions about when I'm going to find a nice girl to marry." He smiled ruefully. "But I can't. Not because of some obligation or debt, but because it's the right thing to do, and because—" He hesitated, then pushed forward. "Because you're alone, and nobody should have to be that alone. The simple humanity of his statement hit Hannah harder than any weapon could have. On Etheria, decisions were made through consensus and protocol, through careful consideration of duty and honor. Individual compassion existed, certainly, but it was channeled through proper social structures, mediated by tradition and hierarchy. This raw, unstructured empathy, this willingness to throw himself into danger for someone he'd known for mere hours, was quintessentially human, in a way she'd observed but never expected to be the beneficiary of. She found herself blinking back the physiological response her people had. Instead of tears, a slight phosphorescence in the eyes that indicated emotional overflow. "You don't know what you're offering," she said, her voice rough. "These people, whoever they are, they have resources, training, weapons. If they capture us, they won't just arrest us. I've seen how humans treat things they don't understand. They dissect them, study them, lock them away in facilities that officially don't exist. And you, for helping me, would be labeled a traitor to your species, a collaborator with alien infiltrators. Your life as you know it would be over." She needed him to understand the full scope of what he was volunteering for, needed him to have the informed choice she'd been denied when her ship was sabotaged. "Walk away, David. Please, save yourself." He shook his head slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know what's funny? My grandmother left everything, her home, her family, her entire world, to come to a country where she didn't speak the language, didn't understand the culture, where people looked at her like she was alien, and she did it because staying meant dying slowly under a regime that saw her as expendable. She always told me that safety is important, but there are things more important than safety, like dignity, like helping people who need help, like doing what's right even when it's hard." He extended his hand to her, palm up, an offering. "So yeah, I know what I'm volunteering for, and I'm volunteering anyway. You're not doing this alone." Hannah stared at his outstretched hand for a long moment, weighing consequences and probabilities, calculating survival odds that dropped precipitously the moment she involved a civilian in active operations. But she was tired of being alone, tired of carrying every burden in isolation, and the fierce determination in David's eyes suggested he wouldn't accept refusal anyway. Slowly, she reached out and clasped his hand, his skin warm against her cooler temperature, his grip firm and steady. The gesture felt ceremonial somehow, a pact sealed without words but binding nonetheless. In her culture, such physical contact between mere strangers would be significant. She suspected it meant something here too. "All right," she said, "but we do this smart. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. We gather intelligence first, map their security, identify weak points. We go in with a plan and multiple exit strategies. And if at any point I say run, you run. No arguments, no looking back. Agreed?" David nodded seriously. "Agreed. Though I reserve the right to argue about the running part if it looks like you're sacrificing yourself for dramatic effect." The attempted levity fell slightly flat given the gravity of what they were discussing, but Hannah appreciated the effort. "No dramatic sacrifices," she promised. "I've seen enough human movies to know how poorly those typically work out." Planning a covert infiltration operation in a basement with improvised resources was, Hannah reflected, not how she'd imagined her military training would be applied. The Survey Corps had taught her surveillance techniques, tactical analysis, emergency field procedures, all designed for use with proper equipment, support teams, and exit strategies that involved faster-than-light evacuation. Instead, she was working with a smartphone David had retrieved from upstairs, a paper map of Lower Manhattan that looked like it predated digital cartography, and a college student whose entire combat experience consisted of one semester of Taekwondo he'd taken for an easy physical education credit. The absurdity would have been comedic if the stakes weren't so desperately high. David had pulled up satellite imagery of the warehouse district on his phone, the screen's glow illuminating both their faces in the dim basement. "This is the area," he said, zooming in on a cluster of buildings near the Hudson River. "Mostly commercial storage, some light manufacturing. Used to be busier before everything moved to New Jersey, but there's still activity." His finger traced along what looked like the main access road. "The warehouse you're talking about, can you identify it from this angle?" Hannah studied the images carefully, her enhanced visual processing picking out details human eyes might miss. The building she wanted was there, third from the corner, distinguished by newer construction on the roof ventilation systems that seemed excessive for simple storage, and what looked like reinforced cellular communication arrays. "That one," she said, pointing. "See the infrastructure? Those aren't standard commercial installations. That's military-grade communications equipment, probably encrypted and hardened against electronic interference. The ventilation suggests climate control far beyond what you'd need for storing furniture or dry goods. They're keeping something that requires specific environmental conditions." She zoomed in further, studying the perimeter. "Cameras here, here, and here. Motion sensors along the fence line. At least 2 entry points, visible main loading dock and a personnel door on the east side. Probably more that aren't obvious from satellite." The security was professional grade, which confirmed her suspicion that this wasn't some rogue operation but something with significant backing and resources. David leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against hers as he examined the screen. "The building next door looks abandoned," he observed. "See how the windows are boarded up? And there's no vehicles ever parked there in any of these dated images." He scrolled through several captures spanning months. "If we could get inside that building, we'd have a vantage point. Maybe find a way to observe their patterns, see when guards change shifts, figure out the best time to move." It was solid tactical thinking, the kind of preliminary reconnaissance that could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Hannah felt a reluctant appreciation for his instincts. David might lack formal training, but he understood the fundamental principle of warfare. Information was the first and most important weapon. They spent the next hour developing what barely qualified as a plan. Hannah would use her remaining functional technology, a sensor suite built into her datapad, to map the warehouse's security systems from the abandoned building next door. Once they understood the pattern of surveillance, they'd identify the optimal infiltration window. David would serve as lookout and emergency communications, positioned where he could warn her of approaching threats while maintaining a line of retreat. The plan was simple because simple was all they could manage. But Hannah had learned during her time on Earth that simple plans often succeeded where complex ones failed, primarily because there were fewer points of catastrophic breakdown. As they talked through contingencies and backup scenarios, Hannah became aware of subtle changes in David's demeanor. The initial fear-tinged excitement had settled into something more focused, more mature. He asked intelligent questions about timing and signal protocols, absorbed her explanations of her technology's capabilities without getting lost in technical details, and pushed back when her suggestions seemed unnecessarily risky. It was the kind of practical courage she'd seen in good junior officers, people who felt fear but functioned through it, who understood danger but didn't let it paralyze decision-making. She found herself reassessing her initial judgment of him as just a civilian caught in circumstances beyond his control. David was proving to be more capable than she'd credited. "We should rest," he finally said, checking the time on his phone. "It's almost 5. Grandmother will be here by 7 to start prep for lunch service. We'll need to move you before then. She can't officially know you're here, for her own protection." The consideration spoke to his understanding of operational security, the need to limit exposure and maintain plausible deniability for anyone who might be questioned later. "There's an apartment upstairs, above the restaurant. It's where I live. Small, but private. You can stay there during the day, and tonight we'll do reconnaissance on the warehouse." He stood, offering his hand to help her up. "Try to sleep if you can. You look exhausted." Hannah accepted his assistance, her legs stiff from sitting in one position too long. The wound on her arm throbbed steadily, and she could feel the suppressants in her system beginning to wane. Another injection would be necessary within a few hours to maintain her human appearance. David led her back upstairs through the now silent kitchen, past cooking stations that gleamed from their post-service cleaning, through a door marked "Private" that opened onto a narrow staircase. His apartment was exactly as advertised, small, consisting of basically one room that served as bedroom, living area, and study, with a tiny bathroom off to one side and a kitchenette that suggested he rarely cooked at home despite spending his working hours in a restaurant kitchen. The space was cluttered but clean, decorated with an eclectic mix that spoke to his personality. Movie posters for science fiction films she'd watched during her crash course in human culture, a bookshelf crammed with volumes ranging from cookbooks to physics textbooks, a desk buried under papers that looked like coursework from the university classes he apparently took between restaurant shifts. It was intimate in a way that made Hannah acutely aware she was entering someone's private sanctuary, a space rarely shared with others. David seemed to sense her hesitation and quickly cleared textbooks off the small couch that sat against one wall. "It's not much," he said, somewhat apologetically, "but it's safe, and nobody comes up here except me. The bathroom has a lock, and there's food in the fridge if you're hungry, mostly leftovers from the restaurant, but help yourself to anything." He grabbed a jacket from a hook by the door, preparing to leave. "I need to help with morning prep, keep everything looking normal. But I'll check on you during my break, and we'll finalize plans for tonight." He paused at the door, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You'll actually rest, right? Not just sit there, running calculations and preparing for every possible disaster scenario." The accuracy of his prediction made Hannah smile despite herself. "I'll try," she offered, which was the most honest answer she could give. David nodded, apparently satisfied with that minimal commitment. "Good enough." "Oh, and Hannah?" He waited until she met his eyes. "Thank you for trusting me. I know that's probably harder for you than the actual breaking and entering part." Before she could formulate a response, he was gone, the door clicking shut softly behind him, leaving her alone in his space with the weight of his trust settling around her like a borrowed coat. She stood motionless for several minutes, simply processing the past few hours. Every instinct she'd developed over months of isolation screamed warnings about attachment, about allowing anyone close enough to become a liability or a target. But David had already made himself both of those things, had inserted himself into her desperate situation, with full knowledge of the risks, and she couldn't decide if that made him incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Probably both, she concluded, which seemed very human, that uniquely contradictory nature that allowed them to be simultaneously sensible and reckless, cautious and impulsive, self-interested and selflessly generous. Eventually, exhaustion won out over paranoia, and Hannah allowed herself to settle on the couch David had cleared. She pulled her backpack close, one hand resting on the plasma cutter in her boot, old habits from weeks of sleeping in parks and subway stations, where threats could materialize at any moment. But the apartment felt genuinely safe in a way nothing had since she'd crashed on this planet. The walls were solid, the door locked, and somewhere below, David was maintaining their cover, acting as a shield between her and a world that would destroy her if given the chance. It was trust she hadn't asked for and didn't entirely know how to accept, but as her eyes finally drifted closed, she found herself grateful for it nonetheless. Sleep came in fragments, her enhanced nervous system never fully disengaging, always maintaining some level of alertness. She dreamed of Etheria, the violet skies of home, the singing crystals that grew in the mountain ranges, the faces of her squad mates who probably thought her dead by now. She dreamed of the moment her ship was hit, the sudden violent lurch as systems failed, the desperate scramble to reach the escape pod before catastrophic decompression. And she dreamed of David's hand extended in the basement, the simple human gesture that had somehow become an anchor in her spiral of isolation. When she woke hours later to sunlight streaming through the apartment's single window, she found herself wondering what it meant that a stranger's kindness haunted her dreams more than the violence that had stranded her here. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it, unchanged except for the angle of the sunlight across the floor. Her internal chronometer said it was early afternoon. She'd managed nearly 6 hours of actual sleep, more than she'd gotten in any single stretch since the crash. The rest had helped. Her mind felt clearer, sharper, ready to tackle the operational challenges ahead. She administered one of her precious remaining suppressant injections, watching as her skin's faint violet undertone faded back to convincingly human beige, then checked the bandage on her arm. The wound was healing faster than it should despite the suppressants, her biology's natural resilience fighting through the chemical barriers. She'd need to be careful about injuries going forward. Her healing rate would draw attention if anyone observed it closely. David returned as promised during his afternoon break, carrying a container of food and an expression that suggested he'd spent the past several hours oscillating between excitement and terror about their evening plans. He set the container on his small desk, some kind of noodle dish that smelled appealingly of sesame and scallions, and immediately launched into an update delivered in the rapid-fire cadence of someone who'd been rehearsing their report. Okay, so, I've been thinking about tonight. My shift ends at 9, which gives us good cover for leaving. I told my grandmother I'm meeting friends for a study session, which she'll believe because midterms are coming up and I actually do have a paper due next week that I'm catastrophically behind on. He paused to take a breath. I borrowed my cousin's car he owes me for covering his shifts last month, so we have transportation. And I stopped by a camping supply store during lunch and got these. He produced 2 headlamps from his jacket pocket, the kind hikers used for hands-free illumination. I figured we'd need light that doesn't require holding, in case we need our hands free for, breaking into places or running from armed guards or whatever other normal Tuesday evening activities we'll be doing. The nervous humor was back, his defense mechanism against the reality of what they were planning. Hannah accepted one of the headlamps, examining its simple LED construction with bemused appreciation. It was perhaps the least sophisticated piece of equipment she'd used in years, but it would serve. Sometimes low-tech solutions were actually superior. No complex systems to fail, no electronic signatures to detect. They ate the noodles together, Hannah's portion carefully small because her metabolism still processed Earth food inefficiently while reviewing their approach plan. David had printed satellite images at a library, marking potential observation points and escape routes with the thoroughness of someone who'd actually paid attention during their methodology courses. The abandoned building has a fire escape, he noted, pointing to a structure visible in the image. Looks rusted but probably still functional. We can access it from the alley, get to the roof, and have a full view of the warehouse complex without being street level where patrols might spot us. It was exactly the kind of detailed preparation that meant the difference between reconnaissance and disaster. As evening approached and the light outside shifted toward that particular orange-gold of urban sunset, Hannah found herself performing weapons checks with practiced efficiency. The plasma cutter in her boot, fully charged. Her data pad with sensor suite, calibrated and ready. The partially functional communicator, because abandoning it felt like surrendering hope even though it remained useless without power. She changed into dark clothing. David had provided his own spare garments that fit reasonably well despite their different builds. The ordinariness of borrowing someone's clothes, of preparing for danger while surrounded by the mundane details of human life, created a cognitive dissonance that made her feel simultaneously more grounded and more alien than ever. David emerged from the bathroom wearing similar dark clothing, looking nervous but determined. "I should probably mention," he said, "that the most illegal thing I've ever done before this was downloading music without paying for it. So if I seem like I have no idea what I'm doing, that's because I absolutely don't." Hannah found herself smiling despite the tension. "The fact that you're doing it anyway says more about your character than any amount of training ever could. Just follow my lead, do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, and remember, if something goes wrong, your priority is escape. Not heroics, not rescue attempts. Just run." She needed him to internalize that priority, to understand that his survival couldn't become her responsibility in a crisis. They left the apartment as full darkness settled over the city, descending through the now closed restaurant and exiting through a side door that David locked carefully behind them. The streets of Chinatown were still busy despite the hour, people moving between restaurants and shops, the ambient noise and activity providing excellent cover for two people trying not to be noticed. They walked several blocks to where David's cousin's car was parked, a battered Honda that had seen better decades, and began the drive across Manhattan toward the warehouse district. Traffic was mercifully light, and within 20 minutes they were parking in a nearly empty lot, 2 blocks from their target, the industrial zone around them largely deserted after business hours. The abandoned building David had identified looked even more derelict up close, its windows not just boarded but actually bricked over in places, graffiti covering every accessible surface. The fire escape he'd spotted hung from the building's rear like a skeletal afterthought, rust evident even in the dim light from distant street lamps. Hannah tested the lowest ladder carefully, feeling the metal groan under her. "Wait, but hold. Stay close," she whispered to David, "and try to distribute your weight evenly. These old structures can fail without warning." She began climbing, her enhanced strength making the ascent easier than it would be for him, but she maintained a slow enough pace that he could follow without struggling. The roof was a landscape of deterioration, cracked tar paper, exposed beams in places, decades of debris accumulated in corners. But it offered exactly what they needed, an unobstructed view of the warehouse complex below and across the street. Hannah moved to the edge, keeping low to avoid silhouetting herself against the sky, and pulled out her data pad. The device's sensor suite came online with a whisper of violet light that she immediately dimmed, not wanting any visible signature that might draw attention. David crouched beside her, his breathing slightly elevated from the climb and adrenaline, his eyes scanning the warehouse with focused intensity. "There," Hannah murmured, pointing to the building she'd identified from satellite imagery. Even at this hour, lights blazed from several windows, and she could see vehicles in the lot, expensive SUVs with tinted windows and conspicuously generic government plates. Active operation. At least a dozen personnel visible, probably more inside. Her sensors were painting a more detailed picture. Electromagnetic signatures consistent with advanced security systems. Thermal imaging showing concentrated heat sources that matched both human occupancy and electronic equipment. And underneath it all, that strange resonance she detected during her first encounter, the quantum frequency that made her teeth ache and her vision blur slightly. David pulled out a small notebook and began sketching the building's layout, marking guard positions and patrol patterns with the focused attention of someone determined to be useful despite being completely out of his element. Hannah appreciated the effort, even as her sensors did the same work with considerably more precision. They watched for over an hour, tracking shift changes and activity patterns, noting security protocols and potential vulnerabilities. The operation was professional guards rotated on precise schedules, cameras covered overlapping fields of view, access points were controlled and monitored. Breaking in wouldn't be simple, but Hannah had identified a pattern in the thermal signatures, a section of the building where heat distribution suggested a power junction or mechanical room, typically less heavily monitored than main access points. "There," she said quietly, directing David's attention to the building's north corner. "That section has weaker electromagnetic shielding. The security coverage isn't as dense. If we can access the building through there, we might be able to move through maintenance corridors to reach the main storage area." She was making assumptions based on standard architectural practices, but the thermal imaging supported her theory that corners showed the kind of infrastructure clustering that typically indicated utility access. David studied the area through his borrowed binoculars, then pointed to something Hannah's sensors had missed. "Ground-level door. See it? Partially hidden by that dumpster. Looks like a service entrance, probably for maintenance or deliveries." He was right. The door was barely visible even with her enhanced vision, painted the same color as the wall and positioned where it wouldn't draw casual attention. More importantly, the security camera nearest to it had a blind spot, a small triangle of space where the angle of coverage missed the door entirely. Sloppy security design, or perhaps a compromise forced by budget constraints or building architecture. Either way, it was exploitable. "Good eye," Hannah acknowledged. "That's our entry point. We'll need to time it between guard patrols, and we'll have maybe 90 seconds to breach the door before the next patrol cycle brings someone back around that corner." They continued observing, refining their understanding of the security pattern until Hannah felt confident she could predict movements with reasonable accuracy. The guards operated on a 12-minute cycle, with a predictable gap in coverage at the northeast corner that lasted approximately 2 minutes. Not long, but potentially enough. The real question was what they'd find once inside the layout beyond that door, the nature of the security in the interior spaces, and most critically, where exactly the device she needed was being stored. Her sensors could detect its quantum signature from here, that resonating frequency that set her nerves on edge. But the signal was diffuse enough that pinpointing its exact location would require getting much closer. David checked his phone nearly midnight now, and his nervous energy had settled into something more like grim determination. "When?" he asked simply, and Hannah appreciated that. He didn't question whether they were actually going through with this, didn't try to talk her out of it or suggest safer alternatives. He'd committed, and he was seeing it through. "Tonight," she decided. "The longer we wait, the more chance something changes, or they detect us, or my time runs out. We go back to your apartment, gather supplies, rest for a few hours, and return before dawn. 4 a.m. is statistically the worst time for human alertness. Their guards will be tired, less vigilant. That's when we move." The plan was set, ridiculous and desperate and probably doomed, but it was the only plan that gave her any chance of escaping this planet. They descended the fire escape more carefully than they'd climbed it, hyper-aware now of every sound and movement, seeing potential threats in every shadow. The walk back to the car felt longer than it had coming. Hannah's senses stretched to maximum sensitivity, picking up every footstep and voice in the surrounding blocks. They weren't followed, she was certain of that, but the paranoia was difficult to shake. By the time they reached David's apartment, her hearts were racing, and she needed another suppressant injection that she couldn't afford to waste. David made tea, actual tea this time, not coffee, with the intuitive understanding that she needed something calming rather than stimulating. They sat in his small kitchen area, the silence between them comfortable despite the magnitude of what they were planning. Eventually David spoke, his voice quiet in the stillness. "If this goes wrong, if something happens to me, tell my grandmother." He stopped, reconsidered. "Tell her I was trying to help someone, that it mattered. She'll understand that, even if she doesn't understand the rest." The request carried the weight of someone who'd truly considered the possibility of not coming back, who'd made peace with the risk enough to plan for his absence. Hannah met his eyes across the small table, seeing in them a resolve that reminded her of the officers she'd served with, people who understood duty and sacrifice. "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "I've survived this long by being careful and prepared. We follow the plan, we get in and out clean, and tomorrow you'll be back here worrying about your paper on whatever incomprehensible topic you're studying." But she understood his need to voice the possibility, to acknowledge the reality they were both dancing around. "For what it's worth, David, your grandmother raised someone brave and good. She should be proud, whether she knows what you're doing or not." The hours before dawn crawled past with agonizing slowness, each minute stretching into eternities as Hannah and David prepared for what might be either their salvation or their destruction. They couldn't sleep despite knowing they should conserve energy. Instead, they moved through David's apartment like ghosts preparing for battle, checking equipment with obsessive precision, reviewing contingencies they'd already memorized, finding busy work to occupy minds too anxious for rest. Hannah administered her second-to-last suppressant injection, watching the violet shimmer fade from her skin one more time, wondering if this would be the final time she needed to hide what she truly was. At 3:30 a.m., they left the apartment in absolute silence, descending through the restaurant where shadows pooled in corners and the smell of cooking oil lingered like a ghost of the previous day's activity. The streets outside were empty now, that peculiar dead zone between night's revelry and morning's industry when cities held their breath. David's borrowed car started with a cough that sounded deafening in the stillness, and they drove through deserted streets toward the warehouse district, passing only the occasional taxi and delivery truck making early rounds. Parking 2 blocks away felt like abandoning their last retreat option, but proximity meant risk of discovery. They approached on foot, keeping to shadows, Hannah's enhanced hearing tracking every sound within a 100-meter radius, the distant rumble of early trains, a dog barking somewhere, wind whistling through chain-link fences. The abandoned building's fire escape welcomed them again, and they climbed in synchronized silence, each movement calculated to minimize noise. The roof hadn't changed, but the warehouse below showed reduced activity, fewer lights, fewer vehicles, the skeleton crew that maintained overnight security. Hannah's datapad confirmed her earlier observations. The patrol pattern remained consistent, the blind spot still exploitable. She watched 3 complete cycles, her enhanced time perception tracking each second with crystalline precision. 12 minutes exactly. 2-minute gap. The margin for error was razor thin, but margins were all they had. She looked at David, his face pale but determined in the rays. Darkness, and made a decision. "You stay here," she whispered. "Keep watch on the radio frequency we discussed. If anything changes, if patrols deviate, you warn me and then you run. Understood?" David's jaw tightened. "We agreed," he started, but Hannah cut him off with a gesture. "We agreed to gather intelligence. I'm gathering it. You're my early warning system, which is the most critical role in any infiltration. I need you here, David. I need someone watching my back who I can trust." It wasn't entirely manipulation. Everything she said was tactically sound, but it was also protection, keeping him out of the line of fire. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly, understanding what she was really doing but accepting it anyway. The next patrol passed below. Hannah counted down 12 minutes, then moved. She crossed the street in a dead sprint, her Aetherian physiology making her faster than any human athlete, reaching the warehouse wall and pressing herself against it just as the next patrol rounded the far corner. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her breathing remained controlled, professional. She edged along the wall toward the service door David had spotted, staying in the camera's blind spot, fingers finding the door's handle. Locked, naturally, but her plasma cutter made quick work of the mechanism, the metal melting silently under focused energy. The door opened into darkness, and Hannah slipped inside, pulling it closed behind her. She was in. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of corridors and storage rooms, each space humming with the low thrum of electronic equipment and climate control systems. Hannah moved through the darkness like liquid shadow, her enhanced vision rendering the blackness in shades of gray and silver, her sensors painting a three-dimensional map of the building's layout in her mind. The quantum signature she'd detected from outside was stronger now, pulling at her consciousness like a lodestone, drawing her deeper into the facility's heart. She passed offices filled with equipment she recognized: surveillance monitors, communications arrays, weapons lockers containing armaments that shouldn't exist on a planet decades away from interstellar capability. Then she found it. Behind a reinforced door in what appeared to be the main storage bay, the device stood exactly as she'd glimpsed it weeks ago, 3 meters of crystalline structure that pulsed with internal light, singing its quantum song across dimensions. But it wasn't alone. Surrounding it were other objects, other technologies, a museum of impossible artifacts that made her blood freeze. Aetherian power cores, Zentarii navigation systems, fragments of hull plating from a dozen different species ships. This wasn't a single salvage device. This was a collection, a deliberate gathering of interstellar technology that represented hundreds of years of advancement beyond Earth's capabilities. Someone was systematically shooting down survey vessels. Her crash hadn't been an accident or an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a harvest. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she stood paralyzed by the implications. How many others had crashed here? How many of her fellow explorers from how many worlds had been brought down, studied, dissected, their technology stolen and repurposed? The warehouse wasn't just a storage facility, it was a graveyard. Her radio crackled softly, David's voice, urgent and low. "Hannah, vehicle approaching. Multiple heat signatures. You need to get out. Now." But she couldn't leave, not without the components she needed. She moved to the crystalline device, her hands working frantically to access its power coupling systems, her plasma cutter slicing through protective housings. The quantum core came free with a sound like breaking glass, and she felt its weight settle into her backpack with relief that bordered on euphoria. She had it. She could contact her people, could escape this planet, could warn the council about whatever was happening here. Voices echoed from the corridor, human voices, raised in alarm. They'd detected the breach. Hannah ran, abandoning stealth for speed, her enhanced physiology pushing her faster than human pursuit could match. She burst through the service door into pre-dawn darkness, sprinting across the street toward where David waited on the roof. Behind her, shouts erupted, flashlight beams cutting through the night. She hit the fire escape at full speed, taking the stairs 3 at a time, her lungs burning with effort. David was there, grabbing her arm as she reached the roof, and together they fled across adjacent buildings, a desperate parkour escape that carried them blocks away before they finally descended to street level. They reached the car gasping, threw themselves inside, and David drove with controlled panic through awakening streets. Only when they were back in Chinatown, back in the relative safety of his apartment, did they allow themselves to acknowledge what had just happened. Hannah pulled the quantum core from her backpack, its surface still warm from the device it had powered. "I can go home," she whispered, the words carrying weight of hope she'd thought lost forever. David smiled, exhausted and exhilarated. "Then let's get you home." And for the first time since crashing on this strange blue planet, Hannah allowed herself to believe it might actually be possible. If you enjoyed this thrilling sci-fi adventure, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible HFY stories. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next epic tale of humanity, aliens, and the unexpected bonds that form across the stars. Like this video if Hannah's journey captivated you, and drop a comment telling us what story you'd like to hear next. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories to life. Subscribe now and join our growing community of sci-fi enthusiasts.